Hey guys, I am DM Zone. This is Gamers Oasis. Let's get into it. So in this video, we're going to talk about old school dungeons, particularly at the very inception of modules being made. And we're going to talk about how they were considered to be maybe too linear, too gonzo, or maybe even like a funhouse dungeon. In the last video, I talked about keeping dungeons weird. Now I'm going to talk about like the random, not actually like a planned weirdness. I feel like those two terms are planned weirdness and random acts or randomness in a dungeon are seen as sort of like the same thing. And they really come from two different origins. One is from your creativity and your mind and what odd things you want to throw in. And random being, well, it's generated, it's random, it's a way to make more out of a smaller thing. For example, you don't curate every room in a dungeon. Sometimes those rooms are populated by random monsters, and that's the part I'm going to talk about. Now this video is going to be a long one, so I'm just going to go ahead and jump to the end real quick and let you know what my closing would have been if I didn't have a second one prepared, and just really get into it. Okay, so let's get into this real quick. So the reality is that Gygax and Arneson and the other co-founder types that were in the part of the development cast, the Bloom brothers and Don Kay, Jeff Perrin, who's not really associated with D&D but certainly had a lot of input, and Rob Kuntz and Jim Ward and all these early types that were very pinnacle into the creation of these things. All these people were coming from a very simulator heavy historical war game type background. We might call things crunch or raw and this type of stuff, talking about rules as written and the rule for cool and these type of things. Back then, it was trying to get out of the simulator and into this fantastic world they were creating. So while they weren't perfect in their execution, and they might have had a few things that fell on the linear or the gonzo or the funhouse side of things, I think they did a very good job moving the direction away from the simulator. And they spoke, well, Gygax was the loudest to speak, but he spoke a lot about simulator. This is not meant to be a simulator. Stop trying to make it a simulator. I found this later when I was going through this game, and the way it was described to me is you have fun over here and you have reality over here, and somewhere in the middle is where the good spot is. If you're having too much fun, then you're basically a bunch of tweens or teenagers or kids, toddler, adult-sized chip bodies type of thing. Or if you're too much of a simulator, then you're old fuddy-duddy who's into like statistics, and you're probably do CPA work for some firm, which is great money, and I hope you enjoy what you do. But somewhere in the middle is where the majority of people are going to be. And that's what I'm kind of be talking about over a couple videos. So if you want to still watch this video after basically know what my finding is, that this stuff comes later and more in the 80s than it does right now, and the founders and the people who really birthed this origin didn't have this in mind, then I guess watch next time I make a video like this, and maybe I'll answer that question better there. But in this one, I'm going to go ahead and break down the terms like linear, gonzo, and funhouse, because there are slight differences, and they're usually used in a negative terminology. For example, linear usually means, as if the word has any other different really meaning, too straight, too linear. All paths go one direction. You might have rooms that branch out, but there's nowhere for those rooms to go. So when you come back out the room, you're continuing down the same path to the next room, to the next room. And while you can skip a room, which could be a different experience for you, most likely you can't, because the things in there will hear you, or there's literally no door. And that's where things can feel linear. I have found in my personal experience that a new player doesn't see the linearness of it. They don't realize they basically walk down a hallway with a bunch of closed rooms. no matter how many turns left, right, up, and down there was. They just see the action in front of them and they're not looking at the bigger picture. However, those who are looking for maybe a more sophisticated game or are veteran players and really have dug into this a lot or build their own dungeons, when they look back on it or they reflect on it, they realize there was only really one outcome to this, and it maybe bothers them a little bit. And I can understand that too, especially if you ever try to replay the same dungeon and it's linear, it takes away that ability to have a different experience. So let's go ahead and break down what the difference is between Gonzo and Funhouse dungeons. Okay, so Gonzo might be you have a skeleton and you have, or zombies, and then you have kobolds or goblins in the same area. And the players are like, how do these two exist? The zombies and the skeletons would kill the kobolds and the goblins just the same as they kill us. It doesn't make sense. And if you don't put work into it, I can completely understand how that would be. Now, maybe there's a reason why the zombies weren't in this area. Maybe they just walked in. Maybe the kobolds and the goblins, being tricksters a little bit and smaller in stature, had worked out some sort of Walking Dead type of scenario where they have a hole that's big enough for them to leave, but the zombies themselves can't get out of because basically the body mechanics of the zombies and skeletons, therefore they're able to lure them into a room, exit out the back, and then shut the door. And then when they want or need, they open the door, releasing the hound-like zombies and skeletons back out to go find whatever, or maybe they themselves are bait and they have some other way to evade. Tunnels are really good for this with kobolds and whatnot because they're natural miners. And in this situation, the zombies now soften up the party, and then eventually the goblins and kobolds may have to fight them, and they're a weaker party. And it's not like the zombies and skeletons are going to take loot, so who cares? Now, how is that different than a funhouse? Well, a funhouse might be like the D&D movie that came out right around the time Matrix came out. You had two polar opposites. One great movie, one really trashy, horrible movie. I'll let you watching decide which one's which. But in the D&D movie, they had packs of beholders that were working as guardians. That, to me, is Gonzo. That is borderline funhouse. Funhouse really is you have no risk, no threat. If you die, it's whatever. Respawns, come back. You step back onto the board. Your name is David 2. And you go. Randall 36 over here is having a bad night, That's Funhouse. So modules have changed since the early days. Instead of having 3 levels at a minimum, a dozen levels is a good starting point type of logic, which I'll get into in a second. We've moved a lot into 5-room dungeons, something that is playable in a short amount of time. And you have a trap room, and you have a puzzle room or trap and puzzle room, and then you have a couple fights and then the boss fight. And that can be punchy and be done with it, and the pacing is different than an old school long dungeon where you're going to be trudging through this for a while. What makes it feel linear, in my opinion, is the fact that you're never leaving. You're there forever. The dungeons being so many levels deep feels arduous. It feels like a long thing, and a lot of it kind of gets glazed over in the process. That's not on the part of the author who writes the module. The Dungeon Master doesn't add things, and that's probably because they didn't have the things to add. I think they could have helped themselves in this area by having a random table to what each room might have. Like in the northeast corner, there's water that trickles down the wall and creates what looks like a slick area over there. Even though there's no light, there's some sort of like moss or algae that is growing on the floor over there, and it has sort of a critic smell. You go into the next room. This room is far drier than the last room. You realize you're in a slight upward trajectory. The floors are not perfect, and there's like a film of sand and dust that spreads across this floor that you did not see in the prior room. As you swipe away, you realize that the floor itself has actually got a pattern to it. It would take a long time to reveal this pattern. And you go on. Things like that make the dungeon. Do these things have to have a function? Is there like a hidden puzzle inside the floor? Are you revealing a trap that potentially could fall out from under you? Is that leak over there going to be a problem in the future? Is that the next place in the dungeon that's going to collapse? Is there a reason why there's algae over there? Maybe there's a surface water, or maybe there's something over there that gives a spark of life, some sort of magic or something. All those things could be up to the person running the game, and having these as a possibility in the thing, I think, would be helpful. So I didn't make these things up. I mean, yeah, I made them up for this, but this concept was not something new to me, and I'm sure they had it in their games, but having a few of these to throw into each module, I think, would have been very good. I'm going to step back into the difference between Gonzo and Funhouse. So Funhouse tends to break away from reality. You have the respawns, you have the sharks with lasers, or at least ill-tempered sea bass, the packs of beholders as guardians. Anyways, as seen on TV, shall we say. It doesn't always have to be so blunt or so direct forward as that. My daughter and I are playing Dungeons and Dragons as sort of like a small group solo type of thing. And this is to get her interested in how the roleplay games and this type of thing work. She's only 8, and I didn't want to force her to play my version of Dungeons and Dragons. That would be not positive, in my opinion, for her. She is in a different stage of her life and definitely lives in the more Gonzo and Funhouse version. For example, she wants respawns to occur. I think that is okay, and we're just here to have fun. However, I do want to build upon something different, and I think that we'll find our way to kind of help guide how the world was built. And we didn't do this directly out of my mind. I wanted to have sort of a shared experience with her. With her, I actually used the 1975 article by Gary Gygax. Now, this article is far older than most of my viewers, as I know that you'd be 50 this year. However, let's just go ahead and dive into some of the things they talked about. It's basically broke up over 5 sessions. You think about different aspects of the world. You create your races a little bit. You create interesting locations. All the things you hear in basically modern day how to build your world. It's extremely similar. So if their mindset back then was the same as basically it is now, not worrying about pantheons and different continents and all of this stuff outside of the village you start at and the dungeon you're going to, and maybe a little bit of the surrounding area and some of the politics and a handful of people in the village for you to get personal with, like, friends, enemies, this type of stuff, then, I don't think their thought process was that far off from what people would want. So that's kind of what I go into. Now, in my daughter's case, we have 3 different types of intelligent elemental plants that are from water, fire, the sun, and earth. Not actual earth, just a barren earth moon, earth-like moon that has a bunch of different things, including caged elephants and monkey companions. I'll probably be doing a whole thing with this eventually at some point in time, though you won't see my daughter maybe outside the arm. You probably will see and hear her talk and enjoy the game. I think I'm going to do a whole series talking about kids in Dungeons and Dragons, because I feel like that's a very important part that is either taken to a level I'm not comfortable with or not discussed at all. So those are the 2 extremes there. And as I have said before, there's the main difference between a Gonzo dungeon and a Funhouse dungeon is the consequences. The Gonzo dungeon, if you die, you're probably dead. With this, I think, Tomb of Horror, this type of thing. When you are in a funhouse dungeon, I'm thinking more of like B solo. That's a literal thing, like B no space and SOLO, which is the last one to come out in the B series, where you basically wake up if you die. And it's a solo dungeon that you can basically run for yourself, and you're inside a castle that's in the shape of a lion. You can't make these things up. I'll have a slide going by so you can see what I'm talking about. Now, in one of the lesser known articles that Gygax did, there was strategic review number 1. It follows right after the spears and why they're so bad in chainmail and this type of stuff, and it dives into solo play, particularly into making dungeons, which is very directly in point with the video I'm making today. I found it very interesting. Once they got through a bunch of housekeeping stuff and how to operate this thing, it was still a very complex system that did lean towards a little bit too linear, I have to admit, and a little bit on the Gonzo side. It required thoughts from the DM, and there were the suggestion in the actual design in the housekeeping section stating that if this doesn't make sense, make it make sense. Change the dungeon so that it works. If it's going off the board, have a turn in there so it doesn't leave the board and go off into a different map unless that's what you want it to do. If that room doesn't fit, make it fit. That type of stuff. And I found that refreshing, that they had this outline, this template that they might have used, and they probably did for some of the layer stuff. It was sort of like a training manual that was unofficial, even though it was done by Gygax. But when you look into what Gygax is saying in the original Dungeons and Dragons, the 3 core books, you don't find that in there. It says that a dungeon should have numeral levels which spiral in all directions, not in a straight line. That does not hint at any sort of Gonzo or straight lines like a linear dungeon. It certainly doesn't sound like a funhouse. I would say it falls squarely in the middle, probably, in that type of thing. And I think that really is where the founders, at least, were aiming. I finally see some Gonzo wonky behavior when it talks about slanting passages that may change secretly the level you're on, taking you from level 2 to level 3, or teleporting terminals like something off a Stargate, or elevators and this type of stuff. Or the biggest one, I think, that it's borderline funhouse would be a mouth of chutes. The only thing I can imagine is you're dropping through a ceiling into a space, and you have to kind of alternate yourself like you're in some sort of Goonies movie, and you don't know which chute you're going to take and where that's going to take you when you get to the other side. Something like off of Ice Age, the animated cartoon, or Goonies, the 1980s style live action movie that came out. It would be a good example of that. The next part starts to do a bit of a better job, stating that the referee would have a good dungeon if it has at least a dozen levels, and that there are always levels under construction, and that there are areas of collapse and things are changing constantly. They get into a little bit of a Gonzo aspect again, basically saying this also helps prevent your mapper from being able to keep straight maps because things are changing, and that was part of the fun of the game. I think in some tables that would be considered fun, in some other tables it would not necessarily be as fun, especially if you're dealing with kids, like in my situation. I think this has more to do with a persistent world, though. I talked a lot about this in my 1974 original Dungeons & Dragons and some other videos I've made, where they have these persistent worlds that you're competing against other groups to try and find different parts of the dungeon to get different loot or different safe areas and this type of thing. So it also gets a little bit Gonzo, talking about the very end of Gygax's dungeon in Castle Greyhawk. Now, I'm sure throughout all of this, it's not like a paragraph. It's like a lot, and it has explanation for all these things, making it not so Gonzo. But the examples it gives is that there's a museum, obviously, for telling stories and these type of things and to keep the history of what's going on in the world. There's an underground lake with some sort of mystery. There are giant fungi that would later be known probably as mycenids. There's a bowling alley for 20-foot tall giants that bowl. Yeah, I mean, okay. And there's an arena of evil. There's an arena of evil crypts and so on. And I feel like if you played in his game, you would not think it's near as gonzo as that paragraph probably makes it out to be. So if you were just skimming over, you're like, whoa, that's a lot of craziness in one spot. But if you played a few years in his game, you would realize how much that makes sense, and all that would be like standard SOP type stuff. I know I'm kind of sound like I'm fanboying at this point in time, but I do believe this is all meant to be part of the fun of the game, and that there's a little bit of a disconnect between the original core books and the things that come after it. So sometime in the future, I'm going to be talking about the other books that came with original Dungeons & Dragons that supported the original 3 books. There's basically 3 supplements. Technically, there's 4.5, but I'm going to get into the 3 that would be most on point for this conversation. And with that, you have Greyhawk with the tricks and traps and these type of things, and the more complicated monsters, skeletons that fire fingers out as arrows that then appear back on their hands, making it significantly more gonzo than the original skeletons of old. Different, more complicated versions of monsters that are half animal and half mythical creature that to hide their powers, like a gorgon and a bull that looks like a bull until it turns you to stone, or something that changes size rapidly, causing it to be from nothing scary to whoa, that's terrifying, and then you kind of move on. And that sounds a lot more Funhouse than I think a lot of the other stuff you're going to run into. And I haven't talked about wandering monsters, but in supplement 1, they have went ahead and changed wandering monsters again from the original books. And this is where you kind of get the zombies and the goblins in the same page, in the same section of the dungeon. And in this case, they could be skeletons that are shooting missiles out that are actually their fingers. But part of the reason why they also did this is they added some classes, and they wanted to represent that. You'll see there are titles of certain classes in these lists, and in the Greyhawk book they started to add things for like footpad and other thief-like things that would be there, because the thief was one of the classes that was added to this book. I've heard the YouTube channel Daddy Rolls a One talk about these type of things, and he goes into this in a different way and in far more detail than I do. And if you really want to get into the weeds on this type of stuff and spend literally 2 hours talking about these type of things, I think it's a good watch. On his video, I think his video talking about titles and whatnot is a good watch, as well as many of his other videos. Again, though, I think this falls on the referee a little bit to find why these things are there and to not make it gonzo. To have a history, to have reality of what they're doing there. So in my game, I tend to do a little bit different. I do things where I tailor sort of an area where it's going to be goblin theme, and I think about what I want my goblins to have interaction wise. Do these goblins work with spiders, or do they work with rats? Do they work with wolves? How sophisticated are they? Do they have any sort of technology? Do they have a strong belief in magic? And I kind of tailor that list around there. And I'll have a few odd things thrown in there that are truly wandering or truly random, or something that comes from a different level. But I put that as like a low percent, and I tend to run this in a multiple dice setup. At least 2d6, for example, is what I roll instead of 8d6. The thing about one dice and having this, since we're talking about wandering monsters, is you have the same percent chance, just like you're rolling percentile, to have everything come up. So a d6 is a 16% chance. So you have a 16% chance of having goblins, and you have a 16% chance of having zombies, and so on. Now, if you roll 2d6, the numbers are all different except for the very tops and everything outside of the very middle is different. So you have just as much chance of rolling a 2 as you do rolling a 12. And then it kind of works to being bigger numbers in the middle, making this kind of like a bell curve. And then that can be kind of predictive. So you have your more gonzo wandering creatures in the small numbers, or the more scary, terrifying things in the small numbers, and you have your more consistent, common things in the bigger numbers. And that's why I use a 2d6 system. It also allows for more options, and I feel like it's 6 chances or a d10 chances is not enough in most situations. And in Supplement 2, it doesn't add a whole lot to the discussion. It does add a little bit of structure to what a module is and kind of into a dungeon, because there is a subterranean level with the Temple of the Frog. And in Supplement 3, Eldritch Wizardry, it does a lot of corrections and adding to the list of things that are already in existence. So really nothing new. Supplement 4 talks about gods and this type of thing. It's not related. And Supplement 5, per se, the Sword and Sorcery, actually is just a correction and rewriting, essentially, of Chainmail, making it maybe a better system to do your large-scale combats and whatnot. So I'm going to look into some of the early modules, and we'll base the rest of this video off of that. We've already talked about Temple of the Frog. We're going to be utilizing that. We're going to be talking about T1, Village of Hamlet, one of the very first modules that come out. And we're going to be talking about B1, In Search of the Unknown, which actually came out in like 1977 with the revision of original Dungeons & Dragons, the Holmes Edition, as they like to call it. I'm not going to go into full module breakdowns for each one of these. That video would be way too long, and I'm probably going to be running all 3 of these at some point in time in hopefully the near-ish future, and I kind of want to show what that was like as far as that goes. We'll talk about those in future videos. So there could be a few spoilers here, so I apologize up front for talking about nearly 50-year-old modules, but I think we'll be okay. So in the Temple of the Frog, there are, oddly enough, mutant frogs that are capable of killing people. They're a specific strain of amphibian that was designed to be the most killer of the frogs. They are actually fairly terrifying, even though there's a lot of references towards Jurassic World and Jurassic Park in this, with DNA and razor sharp teeth and all that type of stuff. This came out long before those movies and books and whatnot came out. There's a religious cult, kind of like in those movies too, of people that really want to make this happen. In this case, there was, I know, shocking, a military that came in, and in this particular case, his name was Stefan the Rock, and he kind of went over and took over this place and destroyed a great portion of it, turning it much into ruin. I know the similarities between Jurassic Park and this are kind of there, but and you could run it like that, and I probably will, but I feel like they're not exactly the same, because there is a little bit more of a sci-fi element, which was the weird Gonzo portion of this. Now, if you were running a party through this, and this was like sitting down on a Saturday night, and we're going to do Temple of the Frog and go, I think this would be incredibly Gonzo. However, this is not designed for a first level party. This party is way later. Unlike all the other modules that came out and all the other books, when you release the thing, you'd be like, and here's an example of how to play. This is not that. This was something completely different. There are over 1,000 guards and soldiers here. There's 400 to 500 evil, presumably, civilians here that are doing work for some sort of mega operation that is in a swamp. It's like G.I. Joe and Cobra Commander type stuff here. Yeah. This is a thing that you need armies there for distraction, for maybe rescuing you potentially, or at least some levels. Or you need to be running the most top-end stealth game possible with lots of, to use a Shadowrun type quote or scenario or thought process, a lot of legwork to be able to get this in here. And you're going to need a face to be able to do this. So this is a very different module that doesn't really resemble at all anything that would be Gonzo or Funhouse or Linear like at all. None of those things are in there. The closest you get is when you run into Stefan and you realize that he's wearing battle armor from a special metal. I won't get into what that is. That he has medical supplies, I'll say it like that, and he has access rings that he's given to certain cult leaders so they can access different parts of the temple. Okay? So without context, I would say that this seems a bit Gonzo. But again, when you add all those layers of all the things going on, I think this dungeon, this module, this doing this thing, answers questions that you've had for why certain things have happened. And the sci-fi elements are gone. It becomes part of your world, and in your world you have these elements. You have these different things that would make it, that would complete the world in many ways. I think it's good. I just think it's a really hard module to run, especially if you're a brand new DM trying to run it or referee. Okay, so let's get done talking about that. Let's talk about T1, Village of Hamlet. All right, so Village of Hamlet is kind of set off of the Kron Hills in the Azure Seas in a land known as Flannis, aka Greyhawk. There are 2 villages in the area. One is named Hamlet, which is a different spelling than what you probably are spelling it, even if you have played the game. And then there's Nulb, N-U-L-B. The module specifically starts off in Hamlet and ends in the Moat House. Now later, several years later, you have T4, which is a Temple of Elemental Evil. And you're going to see these type of things kind of repeat themselves, which again starts in Hamlet and then goes to Nulb, where the temple is and all that type of stuff. And you have this beautiful dude there who's trying to prevent things from happening and all that type of stuff. And like the Temple of the Frog, it goes into deep design, talking about the setting, the history, the world, what the cult is doing, why they're there. And in this case, instead of it worshiping frogs, it's worshiping elementals and it's pretending to be something else, just like a lot of the other things. It talks about the fact that there's ravaging beasts, farmers, and herdsmen in this area, and now there's more. There's a bit of railroading, basically, in this module. First sign of it, I think. As if the party is burdened with too much gold coins or gemstones, the referee is suggested to find ways to eliminate that burden from the party. Because what really makes this module pop is the party not having all the tools to do the job and having to reach out into the community to get people to help them, because that's a lot of the module. It's kind of like the 91210 of the module worlds when it came out, because there's so much history in there. And depending on which version of this you have, and some of the NPCs are so detailed, it tells you their copper coins they carry and where they hide their treasure. Take a beat on that. Where they hide their treasure, as if you're going to go and find all their hidden treasures, or you're going to twist your ankle and realize you stepped in a gopher hole that's actually where the farmer forgot to bury it properly, and inside there you're going to find his whatever, his silver mirror or something. I don't know. It's a bit odd. I will say that. That falls closer to the simulator side. Again, not seeing anything linear. Yes, you have a start point, you have an end point, but you have literal wilderness to get there. When you get to the dungeon, there's like 3 ways in and 2 ways out. There are many ways to get there. And yes, there is a dungeon. And yes, there are frogs there that will kill you. This time by gulping you and swallowing you whole when they roll a 20. But that's a different story for a different time. I'm going to talk about this module in far more depth at some point in time. In B1, in Search of the Unknown, there are all sorts of things that are different finally from this. Again, that do not seem very odd. You have a lot of kobolds and berserkers, the humanoid types, this type of stuff. Again, this simulator style of thing where they're tracking how many mallets and hacksaws a certain room has. And there are teleporting areas that take you to different parts, which is a bit of that Gonzo thing, but not really a big deal. There are also many ways to go through this dungeon, many little mini arcs within this story that you don't have to complete to get there. You could go directly to the second level, complete the thing, and leave if you were unlucky enough to do that, or to find your way there, or cheat and basically do that and take away all the fun for you and the rest of the party going there. Secret note, my daughter doesn't know this, when she does her module, when she does her dungeon, it will be B1. It'll just be set in her world. So I'll be talking about it from her perspective when I do that. There are also a few things in here that come off as Gonzo, and I will talk about that, or close to Funhouse. Except they're Funhouse with consequence. For example, there are false steps that turn into pit traps. You're just going down a set of stairs, have no way to know, turns into a slide, into a pit. They turn back into stairs, you're now in a real pickle. Might be the entire party, these type of things. There's also these different pools, and based completely basically on luck, permanent changes to your character can happen. Some positive, some negative. And that is getting a little bit into the Gonzo thing. Again, this was wrote by Mike Carr, not by Dave Arneson and Gary Gygax. So we're starting to see when you get into these different authors. And Mike Carr has made a great number of modules I love. I am not talking negatively on him. And this was probably one of his first modules he ever wrote. So he probably had that, it's his first one type of thing going on. And I understand that. So let's take all that into consideration and realize that, yeah, there is some linear stuff coming, as I said earlier in this video, but it's not yet, and it's not by the founders. It's by the people they hired, who maybe were not as enthusiastic about the game as they were and did not have the point of reference or the fight against the simulation that they were trying to face while balancing other aspects like the Gonzo, the linear, and the Funhouse. So while I didn't go into many modules and go too far, this video is going to be incredibly long just by itself. I'm going to be going into each one of these dungeons before I move back on and talk about the future of this type of stuff more. But that's because I really want to give each one of these dungeons more of a history to talk about. I also feel like talking about how these dungeons evolve through the editions is a very worthy and good topic. And if Daddy Rolls a 1 gets to it before I do, I am completely open to it. Love to hear his thoughts on it. He's talked about a lot of modules and a lot of type of stuff. And I think we have a lot of shared audience amongst what we, our viewers. Because we have a similar system. He talks a lot more about AD&D than I do for now, but I will be moving that direction because we kind of have the same trajectory of things we want to do, which is we want to talk about the different editions of the game. And having two people in the same space, I think, is absolutely awesome. So if he ever happens to see this, I hope he likes what I'm doing here because I love what he's doing there. Anyways, guys, I hope you guys liked this video. See you guys in the next one. Keep rolling those dice.